Welcome to another audit walkthrough video from SuperfastCPA. I'm Logan, and in today's video, we're going to be going over Audit Area 1. This is Section E. This is a remembering and understanding topic. Identify the elements that comprise sufficient appropriate documentation in physical or electronic form for an engagement. And we're going to be doing that the SuperfastCPA way, which is diving straight into the questions to learn the material. If you don't know much about our strategies, make sure you go to SuperfastCPA.com and check out our free 1-hour webinar training. Again, it's free. It's 1 hour, and we will show you how to pass the CPA exam without wasting months or even years of your time. So make sure you check that out. And after you watch that, you're going to want to learn more. So make sure you also check out becoming a SuperfastCPA Pro member. SuperfastCPA Pro members get access to a lot of great stuff. They get access to the Pro course where Nate goes in depth, every single thing that you should be doing to pass the exams. It's basically a much more in-depth, much more detailed version of the 1-hour webinar. And on top of that, SuperfastCPA Pro members get access to the full 10-question versions of these 5-question videos that I post on YouTube. So if you like going through these questions or you like the other videos that I'm making, remember that if you become a Pro member, you get access to the full 10-question version where you can get extra practice and a bit of extra understanding. Now, with all that out of the way, let's go to the questions for the video. All right, here we are at question 1. Let's just dive straight in. Which of the following is a requirement for sufficient appropriate audit documentation? Okay, let's walk through the options. Option A, audit documentation must be written in a way that a client can easily understand. B, audit documentation should reconcile the accounting records with the financial statements. C, audit documentation only needs to summarize the findings without including evidence of review. Or D, audit documentation does not need to include findings that could modify the auditor's report. Now, reading through those, if you have any idea what audit documentation is, then you probably already know the answer, or you can kind of think through the answer. If you don't know what audit documentation is, then that's okay. We are using these questions to learn what it is and then to learn what makes sufficient appropriate audit documentation. If you don't know what audit documentation is, that's okay. We're going to use these questions to not only learn what audit documentation is, but also to learn, again, what are the requirements for sufficient appropriate audit documentation. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the explanation for this question. All right, here we are. The answer is B. Audit documentation should reconcile the accounting records with the financial statements. Okay, so that's something that audit documentation should be doing. This question is kind of a front-loaded question. There's a lot of information about audit documentation in this question, and this will kind of help us throughout the rest of the video. And some of the most important stuff you need to know about audit documentation is in this question. So let's read through it. Sufficient appropriate documentation must meet specific requirements to support the audit opinion effectively. First off, there has to be reconciliation of records. The documentation must clearly show how the accounting records agree or reconcile with the financial statements. This ensures the financial statements' accuracy and completeness. So that's something that the audit documentation needs to show. Next, let's talk about the detail for an experienced auditor. This is another really important thing. The documentation should include enough detail for an experienced auditor who has no prior connection to the audit to understand the procedures performed, the evidence obtained, and the basis for conclusions. So you should have enough detail in your audit documentation or work papers, and we're going to talk a bit more about, the wording of work papers in a little bit. There should be enough detail in there that an experienced auditor who has no idea, who has nothing to do with the audit previously, can come in, look at your information, your evidence, and things like that, and understand how you got to your conclusions and understand what you did. Another thing that is important for sufficient appropriate documentation is evidence of review. It should include evidence that the audit working papers have been reviewed, as this is a key part of quality control. So they need to make sure that somebody's overseeing this, that things are actually high quality. And then finally, significant findings. Auditors should document findings that could lead to a modified auditor's report. So again, these are some of the most important things you need to know when it comes to audit documentation, appropriateness, and sufficiency. So make sure you maybe pause the video, write these down, kind of understand what they're meaning. And then before we go to the next question, let's read about the other options really quickly. Option A is incorrect because audit documentation is not prepared for client understanding. It is for audit quality and professional review. That's not to say that a client can't maybe sometimes look at it and maybe learn something because the auditor is trying to teach them something, but it is not for the client review. It is for audit quality and professional review. Next, let's talk about option C. Option C is incorrect as it neglects the need for evidence of review and comprehensive support of conclusions, and we talked about that a little bit. Option D is incorrect since findings that could modify the auditor's report must always be documented. So if something comes up that could potentially modify what the auditor is going to report and what the auditor thinks about the engagement, then that needs to be documented. So again, with that, we've talked about a lot of the really important things for engagement documentation, even in just the first question. Now, of course, the other 4 questions are going to teach us a lot of other stuff too. So let's go to question 2 now. All right, here we are at question 2. Which of the following is true about audit working papers? Okay, let's go through the options. Option A, audit working papers belong to the client and must be returned upon request. B, audit working papers should include summaries of all communications with management and evidence supporting the auditor's conclusions. C, audit working papers are prepared primarily to serve as a record for the client's use. Or D, audit working papers must include draft financial statements prepared by the client. Now, we already talked about a little bit of this in the first question, so you probably already know that one or two of them are incorrect. If you want, go ahead and pause the video, think through this, think why we have audit working papers, and we're going to learn a bit more about what audit working papers are in the explanation. So when you're ready, come back, we'll look at the explanation together. All right, here we are. The answer is B. Audit working papers should include summaries of all communications with management and evidence supporting the auditor's conclusions. And this is a much more simple explanation than the first one. Let's just dive straight into it. Audit working papers are a vital part of audit documentation. That makes up probably most of the audit documentation, serving as the auditor's record of the work performed, evidence obtained, and conclusions reached. These papers belong to the auditor, not the client, and are intended to support the auditor's opinion on the financial statements. They are not prepared for the client's use or ownership, though the client may be allowed to reference them. So that is a huge key distinction that you need to make sure you understand. The audit working papers belong to the auditor. They do not belong to the client. So the client cannot force the auditor to give them their working papers so that they can look at them. The auditor can sometimes let the client look at them, maybe to reference them if the auditor is trying to help them fix something potentially. But overall, the working papers are for the auditor so that they can express an opinion and do their report. Now let's talk about the typical contents of audit working papers: documentation of procedures performed and evidence obtained, summaries of significant communications with management, analysis supporting the auditor's conclusions, and evidence of supervisory review and quality control processes. So a lot of what is in the audit working papers, we kind of talked about that in the first question. These are basically how the auditor got to their opinion, the procedures that they performed, the conversations that they had, the analyses that they performed, the evidence that they have and that they looked over. The audit working papers go over all of that so that we can understand how they got to their opinion. With that, let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 3. What is the primary purpose of audit documentation? Okay, we've learned quite a bit about audit documentation already, so hopefully you can kind of pick out what would make sense out of these options. Let's go to option A, to provide a comprehensive guide for the client to improve their internal controls. B, to support the basis for the auditor's report and provide evidence that the audit was conducted in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards, or GAS. C, to create a record of all client-provided information for future audits. Or D, to document management's plans for implementing audit recommendations. Okay, again, what is the primary purpose of audit documentation? I think it probably is fairly easy when you look through these options, but if not, that's okay. Pause the video, think through this, and when you're ready, come back. We'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is B, to support the basis for the auditor's report and provide evidence that the audit was conducted in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards, or GAS. Now let's read through the explanation. The primary purpose of audit documentation is to support the auditor's report and to demonstrate compliance with generally accepted auditing standards. This means it records the procedures performed, evidence obtained, conclusions reached, and that the audit was planned and executed in accordance with professional standards. So the whole purpose of the audit documentation, this is like the primary focus, the primary thing that you are doing audit documentation for, is to show how you got to your conclusion for the auditor's report and to show that you are complying with generally accepted auditing standards. Those are the most important things when it comes to audit documentation. Now, what is audit documentation not meant for? Let's talk about that. It is not created or kept as a tool for the client to enhance internal controls or processes. Again, that is not the primary purpose of it. Potentially, the auditor could talk to the client and kind of show them, hey, here's some things that you could do to improve your internal controls. But again, the purpose of the audit documentation is not for improving their operations. That is not its main focus. Also, only audit relevant documents are included, not a complete repository of client information. And finally, it does not record management's plans or actions beyond the audit scope. So again, audit documentation, main focus is to show what the auditor did and how they got to their report, and to show that they complied with generally accepted auditing standards. With that, let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 4. How does the auditor's risk assessment affect audit documentation? Okay, let's go through this. Option A, audit documentation is standardized and remains the same regardless of the nature or complexity of the entity. B, audit documentation is tailored to reflect the nature, scope, size, and complexity of the entity and its risk profile. C, risk assessment has no direct impact on audit documentation, but only influences the auditor's procedures. Or D, audit documentation for risk assessment only applies to entities with complex operations or high inherent risks. Okay, after reading through those, I feel like just by reading through that, you probably already have an idea of what the correct answer is. But if not, that's okay. think through this, pause the video if you need to, and when you're ready, come back. We'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is B, and I'm realizing that all of the answers so far have been B, but that's not always going to be the case. Audit documentation is tailored to reflect the nature, scope, size, and complexity of the entity and its risk profile. That is something that is true about risk assessment affecting the audit documentation. So let's talk about this explanation. Audit documentation is directly influenced by the auditor's risk assessment. The extent and nature of documentation vary depending on the characteristics of the entity being audited. So let's talk about the nature of the entity potentially affecting it. For example, a nonprofit organization's documentation may differ significantly from that of a publicly traded corporation. Similarly with the scope, documentation will reflect whether the audit is comprehensive or limited in scope. Now for the size and complexity, larger or more complex entities typically require more detailed documentation, particularly in areas with higher risk. And then finally, talking about risk, let's talk about risk profiles. Entities with significant inherent risk or control risks will require more extensive documentation related to risk assessment and response procedures. Basically, to summarize what we just talked about, audit documentation is not standardized. It is customized to fit the entity's circumstances and the auditor's findings during the risk assessment. The audit documentation is not always going to look exactly the same for every single audit. Certain entities will need more or less documentation because they have higher risks, or they're larger, or they're more complex, or maybe the audit was smaller in scope than a different audit. Audit documentation is going to look different based on the nature, scope, size, and complexity of the entity. So that should make sense. With all that, let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 5. Which of the following is required documentation for an audit engagement? Okay, so we've talked a lot about audit engagement and different things about it. Let's go to option A written audit program, an assessment of material misstatement, and a written engagement letter. Option B, draft financial statements and management's preliminary budgets. C, informal notes on audit procedures performed during fieldwork. Or D, a signed copy of the auditor's report and a summary of the client's internal improvement plans. So out of all those options, which one of them is required for an audit engagement? We haven't really talked about some of these things yet, so if you don't know, that's okay. We are, again, using these questions to learn. But if you have an idea, or if you want to pause the video and think about it, go ahead and do so. And when you're ready, come back. We'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are at the answer. A written audit program, an assessment of material misstatement, and a written engagement letter. Okay, so these are the things that, or some of the things that are required in audit documentation. Of course, these might not be everything that's required, but these are some things that you might need to know. So let's talk about them. Certain documents are essential for an audit engagement to comply with auditing standards. First, a written audit program. This outlines the nature, timing, and extent of planned audit procedures and provides a structured approach to the audit. Next, there's also an assessment of material misstatement. This is the auditor's evaluation of areas where there is a higher likelihood of material misstatement, and it helps guide the auditor's procedures. And then finally, let's talk about the written engagement letter. We talked about engagement letters in the previous video. This formal agreement outlines the terms of the audit, including the responsibilities of both the auditor and management. So these are some of the most key required pieces of audit documentation. These documents ensure the audit is properly planned, executed, and documented in compliance with professional standards. Informal notes or client-prepared materials, such as draft financial statements or improvement plans, may be referenced, but do not replace the required documentation. So these are some of the required things that have to be in audit documentation. And with that, we've learned a lot about sufficient, appropriate audit documentation. Before we do anything else, let's do one more part of the SuperfastCPA process called pillar topics. Now, the idea behind pillar topics is as you're going through the questions to learn the material, you will notice the things that keep popping up. You've seen 2, 3, 4 questions about something like the audit documentation has to be sufficient and there has to be enough detail that an auditor who's experienced can come in and who hasn't done anything in the audit before, they can be a part of it. It'll be things like that, things that keep popping up. You write these down as pillar topics in your own words because, again, these are the things that you are learning that are most important from the questions. And as you're doing this each day, you are building your own personal repository of the key points, the pillar topics in your own words from the questions that you went over so that you know exactly what you need to know for exam day. With all that, let's go to the pillar topics for this video. All right, here we are at the pillar topics. Let's just go through each one of them. First, the main goal of audit documentation is to demonstrate compliance with generally accepted auditing standards, or GAS, and provide a solid basis for the auditor's report. Next, audit documentation needs to clearly show how the accounting records agree or reconcile with the financial statements to ensure accuracy, and should have enough detail that an experienced auditor can understand the procedures performed. Next, let's talk about audit working papers. Audit working papers, and this makes up most of the audit documentation usually, include summaries of all communications and support the auditor's conclusions belonging to the auditor rather than the client. Basically, the audit working papers is the auditor showing their work, showing the evidence that they got, analyses that they did, all the different things that they did to get to the conclusion that they got to, Those are the audit working papers. And again, they belong to the auditor, not the client. Now let's talk about the essentials of audit working papers or of audit documentation. And we just barely went over this. They include a written audit program and an assessment of material misstatement and a written engagement letter outlining key responsibilities. Those are some of the key things that have to be a part of audit documentation. And then finally, this is kind of a general point, the auditor tailors the nature and extent of documentation based on the entity's size, complexity, and risk profile. So audit documentation won't always look exactly the same, but we overall learned the basic rules for sufficient appropriate audit documentation in this video and through these pillar topics. And with that, we've gone over the pillar topics and we've gone through the first 5 questions, and that is the end of the YouTube version of this video. Remember, if you like this, you can become a Superfast CPA Pro member, and Superfast CPA Pro members get access to the 10-question version of this video that I'm about to finish recording after this. So go check out becoming a Pro member because you get access to a lot of great stuff, again, including the 10-question versions of these videos and access to the Pro course where Nate explains in detail exactly what you're supposed to be doing every single day. So definitely check out becoming a Pro member. And the easiest way to learn about becoming a Pro member is by going to SuperfastCPA.com and signing up for our free 1-hour webinar training. That is kind of like a very condensed version of the Pro course so that you can get an idea of the Superfast CPA strategies and go from there. That's the best place to start. So make sure you go sign up for the webinar. With that, I hope this video was helpful. If you did like the video, make sure to like it and leave a comment, and I will see you in the next video.